Open any social gathering, any waiting room, any quiet moment between tasks, and you will see the same posture repeated across nearly every person present, head tilted slightly down. Thumb moving in a familiar rhythm, eyes scanning a stream of images that refreshes itself indefinitely. This is, for the overwhelming majority of people on Earth, simply what attention looks like now. Instagram alone counts more than 2 billion monthly active users, a number so large it has effectively become a default feature of modern existence, rather than a choice anyone actively makes anymore. And then, quietly, almost invisibly, there is a much smaller group of people who never installed the app, or who installed it once, used it briefly, and deleted it without much ceremony. Or who maintain an account that sits untouched for months, a digital address with no one currently living there. When this comes up in conversation, the reaction is almost always the same. A slight pause, a look of mild confusion, sometimes followed by an assumption spoken aloud or simply implied. You must be shy, you must be private, you must be missing out on so much. Is everything okay? This video exists to challenge that assumption directly, because the psychological reality behind platform avoidance is considerably more interesting, more deliberate, and more instructive than the culture around it tends to assume. Let us begin with what avoiding Instagram is not. It is not, in the majority of documented cases, a sign of social deficiency. It is not technophobia. It is not an inability to understand or use the platform. For most people who have made this choice deliberately, avoidance is the result of a specific kind of psychological clarity, an awareness of how the platform functions, what it asks of its users, and a conscious decision that the exchange is not one they wish to make. To understand why, we need to look at what Instagram actually is mechanically, beneath its surface as a photo-sharing app. At its core, the platform operates on a feedback loop built around social comparison, a well-established psychological phenomenon first described by social psychologist Leon Festinger in 1954. Long before social media existed, Festinger's theory observed that human beings have an innate tendency to evaluate themselves by measuring against others, particularly in domains where objective standards are unclear: appearance, success, lifestyle, happiness. Instagram did not invent this tendency. It simply built an extraordinarily efficient delivery system for it, one that operates continuously, that selects for the most curated and idealized version of other people's lives, and that quantifies the result in visible numbers, likes, followers, comments, that function as a constant ambient scoreboard. For many people, this scoreboard is invisible in its effect. It operates below conscious awareness, shaping mood and self-perception without ever being named as the cause. But the people who choose to avoid the platform have frequently done something specific. They have noticed this mechanism operating on them, named it accurately, and made a conscious decision to remove themselves from its influence. This is where a second psychological framework becomes relevant: self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Desai and Richard Ryan. Their research distinguishes between intrinsic motivation, which comes from internal satisfaction and personal values, and extrinsic motivation, which depends on external validation, recognition, and reward. Platforms built around likes and follower counts are, by design, extrinsic motivation engines. They train users to seek validation that originates outside themselves, dispensed by an algorithm and an audience rather than generated from within. People who avoid these platforms often demonstrate, whether they articulate it this way or not, a stronger orientation toward intrinsic motivation. Their sense of self-worth is less contingent on visible metrics, and more rooted in personal standards, private satisfaction, and relationships that do not require public performance to feel real. This does not mean every Instagram avoider is operating from a place of psychological sophistication. And it does not mean every active user is shallow or externally driven. The relationship between platform use and psychological orientation is a tendency, not a rule. But the pattern among deliberate avoiders is consistent enough that researchers have identified several distinct profiles, each with its own internal logic. There is the person avoiding for the protection of their own mental stability, having recognized a direct link between their usage and their mood. There is the person whose sense of identity was never built to depend on external audience, and who experiences the entire apparatus of public validation as simply irrelevant to how they understand themselves. And there is the person who has made a calculated decision about where their attention, perhaps the only truly finite resource they possess, is best invested, and who has concluded that an infinite scroll is not it. Each of these profiles deserves a closer look, because what initially appears as simple absence from a platform turns out, on close examination, to be one of the more psychologically deliberate choices a person can make in an environment engineered specifically to prevent that kind of deliberation. There is a particular kind of clarity that belongs only to people who have stepped outside a system long enough to see its architecture clearly. From inside the constant stream of images, comparisons, and curated moments, the mechanism is nearly invisible. It simply feels like normal life, like staying connected, like keeping up. From outside it, the architecture becomes visible in a way it never could from within. This is the vantage point occupied by the people we are about to examine more closely. The first profile is the one we might call the protector. This person did not avoid Instagram out of theory or principle. They avoided it, or eventually left it, because they noticed something happening to their own internal state that they could trace directly back to their usage. A measurable shift in mood after scrolling. A subtle but persistent erosion of contentment with their own life, their own body, their own circumstances, not because anything in their actual life had changed, but because the steady stream of curated comparison had recalibrated their baseline for what normal was supposed to look like. The protector's decision to step away was not weakness. It was a precise act of self-diagnosis followed by an equally precise intervention. They identified a variable damaging their well-being and removed it. The same logic a person would apply to any other substance or behavior shown to consistently lower their quality of life. The second profile is the sovereign self, the person whose identity was simply never built to require an audience. For this individual, the absence of a platform is not a sacrifice, because the platform was never offering something they needed in the first place. Their accomplishments do not require documentation to feel real. Their relationships do not require public display to feel secure. Their sense of who they are was constructed from internal reference points, personal values, private standards, the quiet feedback of their own conscience, rather than external metrics. This is not a claim that they are inherently superior to people who do seek public validation. It is simply a different architecture of selfhood, one that happens to be naturally immune to a system designed almost entirely around the mechanics of being seen. The third profile, the Time Guardian, operates from a slightly different logic, not about identity or mental health specifically, but about a clear-eyed accounting of where their attention goes and what it costs them. This person has likely done the arithmetic that most people avoid doing, calculating how many cumulative hours, weeks, or years a daily habit of scrolling actually consumes across a lifetime, and concluding that the return on that investment does not justify the cost. For the Time Guardian, presence in their actual life, undistracted conversations, deep work, unphotographed moments, has become a value they actively protect, rather than something that simply happens by default in the absence of competing demands on their attention. It is worth being honest about what research in this area actually shows, rather than overstating it. Studies, including widely cited research from the University of Pennsylvania involving limited social media use among college students, have found correlations between heavier platform usage and increased anxiety, loneliness, and depressive symptoms, particularly when usage is passive rather than active. Correlation is not the same as proof of causation in every individual case, and people's experiences with these platforms vary considerably. But the directional pattern across multiple studies is consistent enough to take seriously, and it aligns closely with what avoiders frequently describe from direct personal experience. None of this erases the real friction that comes with opting out. Avoiders are frequently perceived as antisocial, mysterious, or behind the cultural curve. They miss shared references, inside jokes built from viral content, and the convenience of a platform many people now use as a primary method of staying in contact with extended social circles. They are often asked to explain a choice that most people never had to justify, repeatedly, to people who assume there must be something wrong rather than something deliberate. But here is the reframe worth sitting with. Choosing where your attention goes is not deprivation, it is authorship. In a landscape engineered specifically to make that choice difficult, designed by talented people whose explicit professional objective is to maximize the time you spend looking at a screen, simply. Retaining the ability to decide where your own attention lies is no small thing. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of wealth that does not show up in any feed, cannot be measured by any metric, and does not require an audience to be genuinely real. Before this video ends, take an honest inventory of your own relationship with the platforms you use daily. Not whether you should delete them, that is not the question this video is asking. The real question is simpler and considerably harder to answer honestly. When you open the app, are you choosing to be there, or has the choice already been made for you by habit, algorithm, and design? And if you stepped away entirely for 1 month, what do you suspect you would notice first? About your mood, your time, or the version of yourself that exists when no one else is watching?